The Silent Ascent. The man who stole the sky. The Atlantic did not want him. On a morning when the horizon of Long Island was a gray smear of salt and fog, the world was small, horizontal, and heavy. It was 1927, and humanity was obsessed with distance. They wanted to go from New York to Paris. They wanted to stretch lines across the map like spiders spinning webs over dark water. They measured success in miles. But Charles Lawrence measured it in pressure. He stood in the center of a cleared field that smelled of wet chicory and aviation fuel, watching a team of men wrestle an enormous, limp bladder of rubberized silk. It looked like a dead whale, gray and wrinkled, rolling in the weeds. To the casual observer, and there were 3 teenagers on bicycles watching from the road, it looked like an expensive, dangerous folly. "The wind is coming round from the east," said Miller. He was a small man with ink-stained fingers who had spent 3 years calculating the expansion rates of gas at 20,000 feet. He didn't look up from his clipboard. "If we don't inflate now, the fabric will stiffen. The varnish doesn't like this damp." Charles didn't answer. He was looking at the basket. It was not the elegant, woven wicker of the Parisian exhibition balloons. It was a box of corrugated aluminum, insulated with layers of pressed cork and lined with black felt. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a floating meat locker. Inside it were 6 distinct barographs, 3 oxygen cylinders of German manufacture, a bottle of cold coffee, and a portrait of his sister, Clara, who had died of the influenza in the winter of 19. "Let's turn the valves," Charles said. The sound that followed was a low, guttural hiss that seemed to come from the earth itself. Hydrogen, stripped from water by iron filings and acid, rushed through the canvas tubes. The dead whale began to bloat. It lost its wrinkles. It rose from the grass, first a dome, then a sphere, then a towering, teardrop shadow that blotted out the pale morning sun. Part I. The law of diminishing air. To understand why Charles Lawrence wanted to leave the Earth, one had to understand the nature of the air in 1927. To the man on the street, the air was nothing. It was the space between his hat and the awning. It was what he breathed when he walked to the subway. But to the physicists, the air was an ocean of invisible ink, and humanity lived at the very bottom of it, crushed by 30 miles of its own weight. Charles had spent the war in France, not in the trenches, but in a damp stone barn near Toul, parsing meteorological reports for the American Expeditionary Forces. He had watched the young pilots, boys with oil on their leather coats and teeth like white dice, climb into their Spads and Newports to chase the enemy. But Charles had noticed something else. When they went above 12,000 feet, they came back different. Their eyes were bloodshot. They laughed at things that weren't funny. Some of them couldn't remember the names of their mothers. "It's the thinness," he told Miller after the armistice, when they met in a boarding house on 23rd Street. "The soul requires weight to stay inside the ribs. When you take away the pressure, the mind leaks out." "That's not theology, Charles," Miller had replied, tuning a small brass galvanometer. "That's partial pressure. The lungs are pumps. If the outside pressure drops below a certain point, the oxygen can't pass through the membrane. You don't lose your soul, you just starve your marrow." "Then we shall see what happens when the marrow starves," Charles said. Now, the balloon named the Astra was full. It tugged at the hem, stays with a rhythmic, organic jerk, like a horse twitching its skin to dislodge a fly. It was 70 feet wide, a massive bubble of potential energy that wanted nothing more than to find its own level in the sky. Charles climbed over the lip of the aluminum box. He wore 4 layers of wool, a leather flight suit lined with sheepskin, and heavy reindeer hide boots that made him walk like a diver on the seafloor. Around his neck hung his stopwatches and a small silver whistle. "Don't touch the manual release until you pass 15, Miller said, looking up over his spectacles. His face was gray with anxiety. This wasn't an official Army flight. The Bureau of Aeronautics had denied them funding 3 times, calling Charles's designs an unscientific expenditure of domestic gas. They were doing this on $5,000 borrowed from a coal merchant in Scranton. "If I'm not down by 4 o'clock, Charles said, His voice, muffled by the high collar of his suit. "Tell the papers it was a valve failure. Don't let them say I jumped." Charles. Cast off. The ground crew 6. Laborers from the Brooklyn docks who didn't care about the stratosphere, but cared very much about the $2. Charles had promised them drop the ropes. The silence was immediate. There was no roar of a rotary engine, no vibration of timber and wire, no smell of burnt castor oil. There was only the sudden, violent realization that the earth was dropping away. The field became a green handkerchief. The 3 boys on bicycles became black dots. The line of the Long Island coast sharpened into a long, white crescent against the slate-gray sea. Within 90 seconds, the Astra was at 2,000 feet. The air here was familiar, it tasted of salt, and the smoke of Manhattan's chimneys 20 miles to the west. But Charles didn't look at the view. He looked at the liquid column of the mercurial barometer, mounted on the central strut. The silver line was falling. Part 2, the blue grows darker. At 10,000 feet, the temperature inside the open basket dropped below freezing. Charles could see his breath now not as a soft cloud, but as sharp, brief puffs of steam that crystallized instantly on the rim of his leather helmet. He reached down and opened the first valve on the oxygen apparatus. It was a crude system designed by an anarchist instrument maker in Paterson. A rubber tube ending in a pipe stem made of cherry wood. Charles took the wood between his teeth. The gas tasted of rusted iron and old water, but as it reached his lungs, a strange, bright warmth spread through his fingers. The world below was losing its perspective. The hills of Connecticut were flat green stains. The sound of Long Island Sound was gone, replaced by a wind that didn't blow against him, but seemed to whistle through the ropes of the balloon itself. A balloon moves with the air, so to the aeronaut, there is never any wind. There is only a terrifying, motionless suspension while the earth turns beneath. By 11 o'clock, the barograph recorded 22,000 feet. This was the height where the world began to change its colors. The sky directly overhead was no longer the soft, milky blue of a summer day. It was darkening into something harder, a deep, bruised indigo. The color of ink dropped into a glass of clean water. Charles felt a sharp pain behind his left ear. He knew what it was. The air trapped inside his eustachian tubes, trying to force its way out as the external pressure halved. He swallowed hard, his throat dry from the oxygen gas. A small pop occurred in his skull, and for a moment, his hearing became unnaturally acute. He could hear the tiny, dry click-click of the barograph needle moving across the smoked paper of the drum. Click, 23,000. Click, 24,000. He was now higher than any American had ever gone in a non-powered craft. He was higher than the hawks, higher than the clouds that were now forming a vast, white floor, 5,000 feet below him, cutting him off from the world of men. He looked at his hands. The leather gloves were stiffening from the cold, which was now 12 degrees below zero. He tried to check his pulse, but his fingers were too numb to find the radial artery. He had to rely on his eyes. His fingernails, visible through a small slit in his glove mitt, were the color of lead. More gas, he muttered to himself. The cherry wood pipe stem clicked against his teeth. He turned the regulator brass wheel. The hiss of oxygen increased, but it didn't seem enough. His brain felt strangely light, as if it were a cork floating in a bucket of milk. He found himself thinking about his childhood in Ohio, specifically about a red barn that had burned down when he was 7. He could smell the charred pine. He could see the gray horse that had broken its leg in the paddock. "Focus," he said aloud. His voice sounded remarkably thin, like a tin whistle blown in an empty ballroom. The thin air could not carry the sound waves. His words died 6 inches from his lips. He looked at the balloon above him. It had changed shape. At sea level, it had been a teardrop, mostly empty at the bottom to allow for expansion. Now, at 28,000 feet, the hydrogen had expanded until the silk was tight as a drum. The lower neck of the balloon was venting gas automatically, a faint, invisible stream of hydrogen that smelled faintly of rotten eggs. If it expanded much more, the silk would split. He would become a stone in a silk sack, falling 6 miles through the blue. Part 3, the Empire of Absolute Zero. At 31,000 feet, Charles entered the realm of the silent death. The temperature was now 45 below zero. The oil in one of his barographs had frozen solid, locking the needle in place at 30,800 feet. The other instrument, a Swiss model with jewels in its gears, continued to tick, its tiny pen scratching a line that was now nearly vertical. Charles was no longer breathing through his nose. His nasal passages were frozen into small tunnels of ice. He took the oxygen tube deeper into his mouth. His lips blew and cracked. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated until the blue of his irises was a mere rim. The sky above him was no longer indigo. It was almost black. It was a color he had never seen in nature, the black of a well that had no bottom. Yet it was filled with a fierce, blinding light from the sun. The sun did not look like the golden disk of the earth. It was a white, furious star, stripping the color from everything it touched. It burned his eyes through his tinted goggles, yet it gave no heat. The aluminum of the basket was so cold that, when his knee touched the uninsulated corner, he felt a sharp stab through his trousers like a red-hot iron. He was dying. He knew this with a strange, detached certainty that felt almost like gratitude. His mind was no longer his own. It had broken into three distinct voices. One voice was counting his pulse by the throb in his temples. 1, 2, 3, 4. The second voice was telling him to pull the valve rope, to let the hydrogen go, to drop back down to where there were chimneys and women and hot tea. The third voice, the loudest one, was singing a hymn he hadn't heard since he was a boy at the Methodist chapel in Marietta. Oh God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. He looked at the silver whistle around his neck. He had promised Miller that if he reached 32,000 feet and felt his mind failing, he would blow the whistle into the recording funnel of the dictaphone box he had carried up with him. It would prove he was conscious. He reached for the whistle. His hand wouldn't move. His arm was a heavy, dead thing made of tallow and iron. He looked at it, confused. He told his fingers to close around the silver chain, but they remained open, curved like frozen claws. The balloon was still rising. The Swiss barograph clicked, 33,400 feet. At this height, the pressure was less than a quarter of what it was on the Earth. The air was too thin to hold the heat of the sun. It was too thin to hold the sound of his breath. The silence was absolute, a heavy, cosmic weight that pressed against his eardrums until they throbbed with the sound of his own blood. Then came the flash. It wasn't a light in the sky, but a light inside his eyes. A series of brilliant, blue sparks shot across his field of vision, like miniature lightning bolts. He closed his eyes, but the sparks remained, burning through his eyelids. It was the cosmic radiation particles that had traveled across the void of space for millions of years, unchecked by the thick blanket of the Earth's atmosphere, now striking his optic nerve. The stars, he tried to say, but his lips were frozen together. A small drop of blood had emerged from his nose and had frozen into a red pearl on his mustache. The Astra had reached its ceiling. It was floating in a state of perfect, terrible equilibrium at 34,100 feet. Part 4. The Descent into the World. How long he stayed there, Charles Lawrence never knew. The barograph tape showed that the balloon hovered at its apex for 11 minutes before the cooling sun caused the hydrogen to contract. To Charles, those 11 minutes did not exist. He was in the Red Barn in Ohio. He was looking into the eyes of his sister Clara. He was watching the German spads falling through the clouds, over the Meuse like burning leaves. The return was not a triumph. It was an agony. As the balloon dropped into the denser air at 20,000 feet, the pressure began to return. It was like being stepped on by an iron boot. His ears didn't pop, they screamed. The pain in his frontal sinuses was so intense that he fell to his knees on the floor of the basket. His forehead pressed against the cork insulation. The air grew warm. It was only 20 degrees above zero, but to Charles, it felt like the breath of a furnace. His frozen fingers began to thaw, a process that felt as if someone were driving copper needles under his fingernails. He began to vomit. his stomach convulsing with the sudden return of oxygen. When the Astra finally cleared the cloud base at 4,000 feet, the world below was unrecognizable. The gray Atlantic had been replaced by the flat, sandy pine barrens of southern New Jersey. The balloon was falling fast now. Too fast. Its silk sack flapping like a broken wing. Charles reached up with his left hand. His right was still useless. The fingers swollen and black and grabbed the ripcord. He didn't have the strength to check the barometers. He only knew that the green trees were rushing up to meet him like a wall. Yank! The top of the balloon split open. The hydrogen rushed out in a great, invisible sigh. The basket hit the top of a pitch pine with a sound like a pistol shot, rolled through the branches, and slammed into the white sand of a clearing. Epilogue: the evidence of things unseen. When the farmers found him 3 hours later, Charles Lawrence was sitting on the edge of the overturned aluminum box, his face covered in grease and dried blood, his feet bare in the sand. He had pulled off his boots, because his ankles had swollen to twice their normal size. He was holding the Swiss barograph in his lap like a child. They took him to a hospital in Camden, where a young doctor, who had never seen an aviation injury, suggested amputating 3 fingers on his right hand. Charles refused. He lay in the White Room for days, speaking to no one, not even to Miller, who arrived by train from Long Island with his eyes red from lack of sleep. On the 5th day, Miller brought the smoked paper from the barograph. He had varnished it to keep the line from smudging. "It's 34,108, Miller said, his voice trembling. "The Bureau can't deny it. The Navy can't deny it. You went higher than any living man, Charles. You went into the dark." Charles looked out the window. The sky over Camden was gray, heavy, and thick with the smoke of the New York shipbuilding yards. It looked like weed. It looked like something you could build a house on. "What did you see?" Miller asked, leaning closer. "When you were at the top, before the line turned back, what was there?" Charles looked down at his black fingers. He could feel them now, a dull, thumping ache that would stay with him until the day he died 30 years later in a small room in Ohio. "Nothing," Charles said. His voice was different now, low, raspy, as if the thin air had taken something out of his throat that he could never get back. "There was nothing there, Miller. Just the sun burning a hole in the night, and the earth looking like a blue glass marble that someone had dropped in the mud." He turned his face back to the wall. He had stolen the sky, but he had left his soul at 34,000 feet, frozen in the black ink of the stratosphere, where there was no sound to bring it home.